Well, what's the story of your life? Is it a comedy or a tragedy? Comedy is something with a happy ending, fundamentally, and a tragedy as well. It starts bad and gets worse. And is it a tragedy that someone else is imposing on you, or some bit of you that you don't understand? What's the story of your life? Part of that is, well, what do you want? What are you aiming at? That's the reverse of sin, right? You're aiming at something. What do you hope for? So the exercise basically assumes that you treat yourself as if you're someone that you're taking care of. So that's the presupposition. You're valuable, despite your flaws. It would be okay for you, and maybe all right for the universe as a whole, if your life wasn't any more wretched than it has to be. So we could set it up for that. Okay, so now if you were looking 3 to 5 years down into the future, and you could have what you needed within the bounds of reason, what would it be? What do you want? What do you want from your family? What do you want from your friends? How are you going to educate yourself? What are you going to do for your career? How are you going to take care of your mental and physical health? How are you going to resist temptation? What are you going to do with your time outside of work that's productive and meaningful? You get to have it. It's like knock and the door will open. Okay, you've got to knock first. Well, and then you got to pick the door. And I really like this because it is, you cannot catch something you're not pursuing. So now, if you're pursuing it, that doesn't mean you'll catch it. But generally, you'll catch something interesting along the way. That's the thing that's so cool about this. Let's say you set out a vision, you start pursuing it, you don't get what you were after. But you learn a lot as you move towards that destination. And as you learn, your vision is going to change, and you may end up with something that's better than what you were aiming at to begin with. But that won't happen unless you initiate the journey. Okay, so you put together a vision, that's your call to adventure. Get out there in the world and contend with it. Well, you might not get what you want, but you might find what you need. But it won't happen without the pursuit. And that's part of faith, right? Faith is, I'm going out in the world to seek my fortune. And if I do that properly, then the fates will cooperate. People think that the purpose of memory is to remember the past. And that's not the purpose of memory. The purpose of memory is to extract out from the past lessons to structure the future. And that's the purpose of personal memory. And so you're done with a memory when you've extracted out the information that you can use to guide yourself properly in the future. So if you have a traumatic memory, for example, that's really obsessing you, if you analyze that memory to the point where you figured out how you put yourself at risk and you can determine how you might avoid that in the future, then the emotion associated with that goes away. So memory has a very pragmatic function. And cultural memory is the same thing, is that we need to extract out stories from our past that structure our future. And we need that because, well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, let's say, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering, because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering. And what you have to set against that is a noble and worthwhile purpose. And hopefully your determination of that purpose is buttressed to some degree by the wisdom of the past, because you can't conjure something like that up on your own. And if you provide people with nobility of purpose, then they can tolerate the suffering of existence without becoming entirely corrupted by it. And cultures that don't do that, it isn't even so much that they die, it's that cultures that don't do that are dead. They're done. They don't have a story anymore. They don't have a call to adventure. And then everyone suffers stupidly as a consequence. It's a very bad thing. Bring the story forward and propagate it and make it the most noble possible story. And then you motivate people to transcend themselves, which they need to do. And if you know enough so that you're satisfied with your life and everything has ceased to be a tragedy around you, well, then you can be comfortable in your circumscribed domain of totalitarian knowledge, let's say. But if your life is insufficient and you're suffering more than you want to and everything isn't what it should be, then you need to look where you haven't looked for what you don't have. And then you can look outside, beyond you, and then you can make friends with what you don't understand. When you do something to the least of people, you do it to me, him, right? And that's a very difficult statement to understand too, but it's something like, it's something reminiscent of
the requirement to keep the idea of the transcendent reality of the person in mind at the same time you keep their proximal reality in mind. To have your mind in two places at the same time when you're talking to people. And so then, you know, if people mistreat you, you see this with antisocial kids. It's a very tragic thing to see, because if you're an antisocial child, by the time you're about 4, you're very hostile and distrustful to people. And so you're like a growling puppy. And if you're a growling puppy, you tend not to get petted, you're more likely to get kicked. And if you're a growling puppy and you get kicked, then you have even more reason to growl. And that's sort of the story of antisocial kids. If they're not well socialized by the time they're 4 and they're more on the aggressive side, then they alienate themselves from the community and all they get is rejection. Well, and then they look at the rejection and they think, well, to hell with humanity, you know? And no wonder they think that. But the part of the catastrophe is that they get what they evoke. And I'm not saying it's their fault precisely, but it doesn't matter. That's still what happens. And so you might ask yourself, if you're not getting from people what you need, there is some possibility that you're not approaching, especially if this happens to you repeatedly across people. And this is a virtual certainty. If it happens to you repeatedly across people, especially if you have the same bad experience with people, it's not them, it's you. I would say 3 is the limit. If something happens to you once, you write it off. If it happens to you twice, it's like you open your eyes, but you write it off. But if it happens to you 3 times, it's probably you. Or it's the rest of the world. Better it's you, because you're not going to change the rest of the world.
Like, we have the idea that there's a deity that's father-like. So it's a disembodied spirit in some sense, that's eternal, that has paternal characteristics. It's like, okay, well, strip it of its metaphysics. Only I'm not saying that fundamentally you have to strip it of its metaphysics. I'm not making that claim. I'm saying if you strip it of its metaphysics and just look at it as a biological phenomena, it's like, well, what might the idea that there's an eternal paternal spirit, what might that be a reflection of? Well, it's like, well, there's you imitating your father, but your father imitated his father, and his father imitated his father. And so in some sense, what your father actually imitated was the pattern of fathers across time. And you could think of the transcendent father as the pattern of fathers across time. That's the right way to think about it. And it's even developmentally and neurobiologically correct, because when a child imitates his father in pretend play, you know, you think, well, when you're pretending, you're imitating. We're pretending to be your father when you're playing house, for example. You're imitating your father. It's like, no. If I'm imitating you, I do this, right? So I'm mimicking what you're doing with my body. But when I'm pretending to be my father, I'm doing something way more sophisticated than that. I'm observing my father across multiple situations. And then I'm abstracting out the commonalities in behavior and attitude across those situations that make him father. And then I incorporate that and dramatize it in my pretend play. It's unbelievably sophisticated. And so it's what the child is doing in pretend play is coming to embody the disembodied spirit of the father. So that's the disembodied spirit. But that disembodied spirit is a reflection insofar as the child is making contact with the father and not just the idiosyncratic personality of his particular father. He's abstracting out the generality across all those situations. And that generality is in turn a reflection of the imitation of the father going all the way back in time. And so you think, well, that is a disembodied spirit. It's a disembodied spirit that's incarnated in the collective of fathers across time. And what is that? Well, it's a judge, that's for sure. It's a judge. Even when you interact with the hierarchy of men who are currently alive, something can be abstracted out of that that's like the patriarchal spirit. And if you don't think that's judging you, you are not thinking. It's absolutely judging you. That's what rank orders you in a hierarchy. It's even what the feminists accuse our culture of being, that disembodied, judgmental, patriarchal spirit. There's something to that. Of course, they think of it only as a tyrant, which is a big mistake. The radical leftist feminist critics, to be more precise, and not all of them are even feminist, make the argument that there's nothing in our hierarchies accept tyranny and exclusion. It's like, well, that's completely preposterous. They say that while sitting in comfortable armchairs with the electricity on and the water running and no riots in the street and well fed and well clothed and protected from their enemies. I mean, it's so preposterous. I can't even believe we've even come to this point.